Welcome to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast, hosted by Alison Humphreys. The Recruitment Leadership Podcast is here to help those in the recruitment industry gain awareness and understanding on the hot topics faced by those in the business of hiring people. In each episode, Alison Humphreys is joined by a fellow expert to offer professional knowledge, insight and advice on the biggest subjects affecting recruitment businesses. It's the podcast to listen to for recruitment business frontrunners seeking expert information from industry-leading advisors. Welcome to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.
So hello and welcome to this episode of the Recruitment Leadership Podcast. I'm Alison Humphreys. I'm delighted to be joined today by Simon Whitehead, who's an employment partner at Brabners legal firm and formerly managing partner of HRC Law.
That's right.
So Simon, thank you very much for making time to do this with us at what I'm sure is a busy run-up to...
Interesting time that we're in at the moment. Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Busy run-up to IR35 implementation. Simon, for anyone who didn't hear it, Simon actually was kind enough to record a podcast, I'm going to say about 14 months ago.
Yeah, probably.
When there were a lot of unknowns about IR35 changes. We're in a completely different position now. And so at Recruitment Leadership, we felt it would be very useful for our listeners to drill down on some of the minutiae. Just to do some scene setting, what we're not going to do is run through the basics. So I'm kind of expecting that our listeners understand the shift in liability under the new regulations and broadly who it applies to. So we'll go from there. Simon, I had a quick listen to the podcast we did just over a year ago. And in that context, you were saying about the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, the Taylor Report, that you thought that we were moving into a new era of regulation, if you like, for recruitment.
I think
Do you
that's
still feel
right.
That?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think we're moving more into a sort of more corporate regulation rather than an individual regulation. There is a bit of uncertainty at the moment because of the wonderful B word and Brexit and the amount of time that has taken up from the government's perspective. We should have had, for example, around IR35, we should have had the budget in November last year, but instead we had a general election. And, I don't think anyone expected the Conservatives to get to the majority that they did. And it's been interesting since December, obviously them trying to get to a position with Brexit where they knew what was happening in respect of that. But we've not really come out of the blocks yet. And we've not really got a true sense of travel of direction for this government. But I do still think that it will be a more corporate regulatory background that we'll see. There's certainly rumours still afoot about a super regulator, so bringing together the Employment Agencies Inspectorate, the GLA, the National Minimum Wage part of HMRC and some of the immigration powers, so there is one regulator that's looking at flexible working, the gig economy, however we want to phrase that. But it is an element of uncertainty because the Taylor Report really was Theresa May's baby. It was very much her personal sort of report and appointment that she made of Matthew Taylor. And, we've not really seen sort of Boris Johnson's sort of take on that and how we're going to go. And obviously you sort of see what's happened so far around sort of Dominic Cummings and the special advisors and his dislike of HR, shall we say, and that sort of area of wanting to be a little bit more radical. And it'd be interesting to see if that plays out and how it plays out into policy. And at the moment, we've not got that sort of big policy picture. But if I was a betting man, I'd say that we'd still be heading towards a more high-level corporate because that sits more within the politics of where we are at the moment. And it'd be interesting to see how that impacts. And, IR35 is an interesting starting position, really, because we've had, so it played a part in the manifesto or certainly in the campaigning, and the Conservatives promised to do a review. We're sort of still in the middle of that review. It should have reported on the 20th of February, but it was still taking evidence as of earlier this week in the House of Lords. So I think, the reality is it will happen on the 6th of April. I think there was some doubt as to whether it might or might not, certainly around general election time. I do think it will happen, and certainly the sort of comments and positioning that's been coming out of HMRC suggests that's really going to happen. And certainly the new Chancellor is talking very much about soft landings now, as opposed to delaying or not doing it at all. And what we're taking that to mean is very much HMRC being a little bit more sort of comfortable or reasonable or relaxed about potentially not getting it right straight off from the 6th of April. And one of the things that has changed since we spoke and where we have got a bit of clarity is that what they've now said is that it'll apply from the 6th of April. So prior to that, we were in a situation where it was, well, if you pay an invoice after the 6th of April, it could be for services that were supplied prior to the 6th of April. And so that was causing confusion and difficulty because people were saying, well, actually, we need to be terminating contracts early to make sure that we're clear for the 6th of April if we've got a problem around people being inside or outside of IR35. And it's very hard to advise because we've not got all the budget and the final legislation's not come out yet, but they have now cleared that up and said, well, it'll apply from the 6th of April. So it's any services that are provided post 6th of April that the new rules will apply to. I think that does two things. One, it gives us a bit of clarity, but more importantly, I think it gives us a very firm signal that it's likely to be happening on the 6th of April. It is going to happen.
Yeah. So we're focusing on the detail of implementation now. Okay. And the direction of travel then, as we see, for the recruitment industry and specifically those people who have been running temporary contract books is towards more regulation. So for decades now, politicians have been talking about Britain's flexible workforce. I'm not sure often when they spoke to camera, they actually understood what they meant by that. I think they thought it was people who were double jointed or were just willing to stay a bit late to work sometimes. But in fact, we have had a legal framework that has facilitated the rise of flexible working compared to other countries, haven't we? And the direction of travel, and we can't really put it any more specifically than that, is towards something more regulated, more European. Is that a fair statement?
I think if it's been hypercritical, I'd say we sort of probably want our cake and eating it to a certain degree. We've obviously got a skills shortage. We've got a people shortage. You know, the new immigration rules are very clear, and you know the commentary that's coming around in respect of the new immigration position at the end of the year when the transition period ends is highlighting how few people we've got or how little manoeuvrability we've got within the sort of numbers of people to fill the gaps that we've got for what we need. You know, we're pretty much at full employment. So that flexibility is still craved by employers and is still in use and is still wanted. But at the same time, we've got a sort of position where they need to recover more tax. So, you know, we've ended up with a large number of contractors. I mean, you know, IR35 as a concept is not a new concept, as we talked about last time. You know, it's been around since 1999, 2000. Nothing's changing in respect of whether you are an employee or a self-employed, whether you're inside or outside of IR35. All that's changing is that the government are changing the rules, so it makes it easier for them to recover the tax that they say is due on it, which is very much in line with where they want to go around. So from a tax perspective, wanted to move more to an American situation where it's very much everyone's going through payroll and it's very easy to track where the tax is coming from and where it should be paid. But then at the same time, want to keep an element of flexibility. So it is a bit muddled at the moment, I think, really, as to how we'll have to see how it all beds in, because certainly if you look at the public sector, and it's hard to make comparisons because they are so different, but obviously the rules changed there in 2017, and anecdotally, lots of my clients were telling me that they saw an increase in the number of candidates that wanted permanent roles, not necessarily an increase in the number of permanent roles, because I don't think the budgets were there to ultimately take people on permanently, but they all said ultimately there were many more people that they had on their books looking for permanent positions. And it will be interesting to see how it does play out in the private sector when we finally get there.
And based on estimates in the public sector, I've read figures like 5.5 billion of extra tax has been collected from employers and workers, or employees now, since those changes were made. So I'm sure that there's an expectation of a lot of revenue in the private sector too.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, certainly that was the position when they started about this. And as much as, you know, we need to get our own house in order. You know, we can't expect the private sector to be doing this if the public sector aren't already doing it. And, you know, we all know, and, you know, both you and I will know more than most people, that, you know, the beast of government, if you like, the public sector, it was full of people that were ultimately putting services through contracts when the reality was there was very little to differentiate themselves between an employee and a contractor. So I think it was right that they started there, and I agree, the figures are quite eye-watering if you accept them at face value. And I know a lot of commentators who perhaps have spent more time digging into them aren't necessarily as accepting of the figures that the government have put out. But I mean, I saw, for example, in year one, I think the tax saving or the tax revenue that was generated was 550 million. And that's the public sector. So the private sector, I think, certainly the figures are, if they don't do anything by 2022, 23, I think it's something like £10 billion that they would expect to be losing per annum by not enforcing the rules around IR35 properly.
So highly
so
motivated.
Big numbers, yeah.
Okay. Right. Now, in the interval since we last did a broadcast, I've had a lot of conversations with people that have got more and more detail focused. And in very broad terms, those conversations break down into three groups. The first of which is small business owners, small recruitment business owners, who really haven't done anything so far. I think, to be fair, they hoped at the beginning of this year that it might not happen. And they've been waiting to see what happens. So it would be helpful, I think, if we just address that group first, if you could identify the risks, and then we could talk about what's absolutely essential for them to do now.
Yeah. And I think it's understandable. I mean, we've all been around, I've been advising recruitment businesses for 20 years, and it's just a constant state of change, basically. And I think a lot of the time, it's a bit of a damp squib. So there's lots of things, lots of changes that happen that people talk about really impacting. It happens 6 months after it happens, everyone's sat there going, really? It's not, the world has not ended. We've not all fallen off the edge of a cliff. And I think to a certain degree, the same will apply here. And I do think some smaller businesses have taken that approach of sort of saying, well, it's just another one of these things and it'll all sort itself out. I also think there's a bit of confusion still about who it applies to. So obviously part of what the government did to try and make sure that they couldn't be criticised ultimately for making it too onerous is that they used the Companies Act definition of a large or a medium and big company and said, look, these changes in how we collect the tax or the liabilities will only apply to those companies that fall within that definition. And off the top of my head, I think it's sort of turnover of 10.2 million, more than 50 employees, I think balance sheets of 5.1 million. And still, so I was doing an event yesterday and there's still confusion out there as to who it applies to. And actually that definition of a big company applies to the engager, the end user, not the recruiter. And still there is, I think, a bit of a myth out there that actually, well, I'm a relatively small recruitment business, therefore it doesn't apply to me. And it's sort of like, well, that's not how it works. Who are you supplying? Well, I'm supplying Amazon or Tesco or whoever. Well, absolutely it will apply to you because the people that are using your services, the engagers, the end users, do fall within that definition, and therefore it will apply. So it doesn't matter as a small recruitment business that you're small, it's who you're supplying to that's the important factor. And again, I don't think end users understand that either. So again, yesterday, a client or an end user who was at the event that I was speaking at was part of a very big global business, but had a relatively small presence in the UK. Now we need to work out just exactly how it was structured and whether it does fall within it. But my gut feel was, of what I heard was, well, I think you will, because it's about groups of companies and associated companies, and you're obviously using services in the UK. So you certainly need to get to the bottom of it. I don't think you can simply just rely on the fact that, well, we're relatively small in the UK, so therefore it won't apply to us, when actually you're a part of an absolutely huge global brand that will 15 times over apply.
Of course. So if you were talking to one of these very small recruitment business owners who's so far done nothing, they may only have a handful of contractors or workers who are affected. But what are the absolute essentials that you would advise them to act on now?
Bit of an audit, bit of a sense check of who we've got and what we've got. How many contractors have we got? What sort of groups do they fall into? And then what I'd probably do is the CEST test, so the contractor employment status sort of test, which is on HMRC's website, run through that and get an idea of whether people are falling inside or outside IR35. If they're falling outside of IR35, then really it's business as usual, not much to do and not much to consider. If they're falling inside of IR35, then you need to start a dialogue with your clients, really, and ultimately decide how. And very much I'd take a partnership approach, because if you're not going to talk to your clients, then one of your competitors will be talking to your clients. And that's a really good opportunity to sell the skill that you bring to the services that you provide. And it's a good opportunity, a good touch point to have dialogue with your client and to appear knowledgeable, interested, and adding value to the relationship. So, you speak to your clients anyway, but certainly if they're falling with inside IR35, then have the conversation with the clients about how are you going to approach this and deal with it. But you need to know what the problem is first, or whether you've got a problem before you can really do anything.
Now, on a very practical note, if somebody hasn't taken any steps so far, and perhaps there's a delay on getting a determination on a job, should they be advising their contractor that they're going to terminate the existing contract with a view to starting a new one after 5th of April?
Not necessarily. I mean, it depends, because the way that it ultimately works, you can continue to engage with those contractors, but obviously you're going to need to change the terms. So it may be that is the way of doing it, is that you just simply have to terminate the contract and start afresh with a new contract. The only reason for doing that will be to make the figures balance, because clearly what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to deduct at source if they're inside of IR35, and you're going to have to find employers and I. So you're really going to have to, if you can't get any dialogue or you can't get any sense from your engager client, then unless you're prepared to subsidise the employers and I aspect of it and the apprenticeship levy aspect of it, you're going to have to terminate the contract and start again, because you're going to have to reduce the day rate down to a rate that ultimately allows you to do that. And what you can't do is you can't keep the rate as it is and then just make a deduction in respect of employers and I, because that's unlawful. So you're going to have to approach it as a new negotiation with that contract to say, well, your new day rate going forward is going to be whatever the figure is, less the deductions for NI and apprentice levy, and then make the deductions for employees, tax and national insurance.
So new schedule at least, at very least.
Absolutely,
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and the contract will need to change, but they're not as big changes, I don't necessarily think. If you've got a pretty decent consultancy contract or a contractor agreement in place at the moment, the changes are relatively minimal, because all you're doing is you're applying a statutory requirement to deduct at source. It's just about thinking how you make up that payment and making sure that those elements, which are the employer's contributions, so the national insurance and the apprenticeship levy, are sitting at the right side of the line, if you like, so that it's not a deduction from their day rate. Their day rate is an amount less than the deductions that you need to make in respect of those.
And you just mentioned the CEST tool, and I've advised a lot of my clients, recruitment business owners, to go and have a look and play around with the CEST tool. It's quite clear that the way the questions are asked, they could be answered very often about the same assignment in two different ways. And although HMRC say they will abide by in the determination of the CEST tool, they've reserved the right to say you didn't fill it in properly, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's got to be right, because otherwise it's just carte blanche, isn't it, for you to answer the questions however you want to answer them to get the decision that you ultimately want that's going to be beneficial to everyone in the supply chain. But yes, I mean, that's right. And that tool's been around for a long time. They've upgraded it. They've enhanced it. They've made it better. It's still cumbersome, and it still often leads to an undeterminative decision. That is probably by design, because the reality is that the case law is quite complicated now around that. So, in the halcyon days around 99, 2000, it was relatively easy to determine who was outside of IR35 and who was self-employed, because very much it was all down to the contract. The contract was king, and provided that you had a substitution clause in the contract, then you tick the box and away you went. So it would be very easy to do a status determination in the good old days, because it was literally contract, substitution clause, tick, tick, boom, there you go, you're outside of IR35. Obviously that was open to abuse, and the courts have reacted to that and have the decisions that have come out have enhanced that or complicated or made it more sophisticated now in respect of the test around whether you're self-employed or whether you're or an employee, so inside or outside IR35. And that test is complicated, and it's very hard to dumb it down. I'm a technophobe, but I wouldn't like to even think about trying to work out how you would ask those questions. And the questions are designed to make you think. So we had a client probably about 3 years ago now, big business using lots of contractors, and they had someone doing the CEST tool and were basically answering the questions the wrong way around. And so when they asked a question, they'd not understood the question properly, and the answer that they gave was the reverse. And so the decisions were all over the place, and we were looking at them thinking, gut feel, having done this for 20 years, is they should be outside of IR35, surely. But for some reason, they've got a status determination telling them that they're inside of IR35. Unravelled it, and it's because the person that was answering the question hadn't understood the question and was answering it in the reverse way. So for instance, said one question was, do you provide company cars, or do they need to use vehicles for the purpose of the work that they're carrying out? And they'd answer the question, yes, they do. But then when we asked the question, it was like, well, no, they don't. They need to travel to and from work like everyone else does, and they might use a car, but actually when they get to the office, they're in the office. And so you need to understand the questions, and that's really part of where I think a lot of the difficulties arise, is that people don't fully understand
the burden of the question.
Absolutely,
yes.
And there are some people who will manipulate the answer, so they know that if they give an answer, then it's more likely it's going to point them in one direction. And that's, again, why they've used that. So the first thing that HMRC will do when they're investigating these things is that they'll go and talk to the people on the ground. So they'll go and talk to the contractor. They'll go and talk to probably either the operations manager or the person that ultimately is in charge on a day-to-day basis, and we'll ask the questions to them. And that's where the problems start, because the answers to the questions they get at that level. So, for instance, around substitution, have you got the right to substitute? I don't know. Have you ever substituted? No. How would it work if you substituted? Well, I don't think I would ever substitute. And they say to the operations manager, is the right substitution? Absolutely no way. We wouldn't accept anyone else. But yet we've answered the question from a central perspective of saying, yes, we have a substitution clause in our contract, and yes, we would have the right to substitution in certain circumstances. And so HMRC will grasp that and will run with that and say, well, look, this in practice does not reflect what you've told us in the answers to your question. So you can't rely on then a status determination when you've either manipulated or incorrectly answered the questions, and it doesn't reflect on what's happening. You've
just highlighted an interesting point that, again, from the statements that I'm aware of, that determinations that have been coming out, there was a now perhaps slightly out of date belief that substitution was the trump issue.
Yeah.
And in fact, supervision, direction and control now seems to be much more important.
I'd say it changes, it evolves. Substitution still is a big thing. So if you think, what's the difference between an employee and someone who's genuinely self-employed? And the example I always give is the window cleaner. I might get Joe Bloggs cleaning my windows, and he comes around and cleans the windows, and then one week I get someone completely different cleaning the windows. I don't think what on earth's going on there. I still just can pay the same company in respect to cleaning the windows, and I just assume that he's on holiday that week. Well, if you're an employee, that's not how it works. And I know that's quite a sort of an obvious example, but I think it's quite a good example to use to say, well, that's the difference. As an employee, you can't just simply say, oh, I'm pulled today, can I send you in to do that? Whereas with a contractor, someone that's self-employed, you can. So I still think that's a really important point. I agree. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all that it was. I think supervision, direction, control comes into it much more than it ever did. But what we're finding from the ones we're doing is quite a lot around the expenses and the burden, the financial risk that you're taking. Mm-hmm. That seems to have come up the rankings somewhat in recent times.
So, for example, the duty to make good work at your own expense if you're a genuine contractor.
Yeah, or ultimately providing your own equipment, or those sorts of things where you're spending money to do the job, because again, as an employee, you would expect all that equipment to be provided, and that I think it's regularly tweaked and being moved around. So it's interesting just to see how that works.
Okay. All right. So moving on, there's a second group, arguably overlapping, a second group of recruitment business owners that I work with who have really struggled to get their clients and candidates to some extent to engage in any discussion about IR35. So by way of example, some of their end user clients have sort of assumed that it's not actually a legal issue, it's a recruiter's issue. Some have assumed that they would just cover the cost, and many of them are just saying, no, I'm not going on CEST tool. Have you got any advice for them, briefly?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and it's always hard because, it's like taking the horse to water. But ultimately, end engagers have to get on board with this, because ultimately the liability will pass to them. And I agree with you. I think engagers, end users have been slow off the mark, and still lots are not understanding, because it's not their world. They've never had to even think about it in the past. They use a recruiter to supply them with labour, and ultimately that's the service that's being provided. They've never had to really apply the mind to IR35, because the liability would never have really made its way up the supply chain. I think it's just got to be about education. It's about getting in front of the right people. And, that tends to be, I would say, probably more finance. So senior accounting officers. So most large companies will have someone in their organisation that has to sign off personally each year to say that their supply chain is free from, and I paraphrase, but free from any sort of tax evasion, tax avoidance, and everything's compliant. And if they sign that and they don't know what's going on, or something has gone on, then that's a personal liability for them, career over. So, in the worst case scenario, finding your way to probably the finance team.
Right.
And getting past procurement, because obviously procurement have got a different view on it, in as much as they want the services, and they want the services at the best price.
Yes.
And they're not always engaged. So again, very recently, certainly this year, beginning of this year, very, very big, well-known, prides itself on ethical and moral sort of approach and its social conscience, if you like, in respect of how they deal with their suppliers. And the senior procurement person that we were dealing with there in respect of trying to negotiate, just simply turned around and said, well, we don't care. That's the price we're paying. That's the contract we've got. You've got to make it good.
So there is a buyer power issue, isn't there? Okay. So just before we come to a close, I'd like to talk about some of the more exotic models that have been entertained, if not implemented, by some recruitment businesses. So what I'm thinking about here is alternatives to CEST, statement of works, thinking about persuading their clients to have their dealings through a smaller subsidiary, these kind of things. Can you give us your thoughts and experience on those?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the starting position is it depends on everyone in the supply chain's attitude to risk. And if you've got a zero attitude to risk, then really you just need to be going with the CEST tool, and you need to just be following the path, if you like. That obviously comes at a cost, and that's where that sort of analysis of risk comes in. But the CEST tool, as you referred to earlier, that the advantage of that, even though it is cumbersome, it can be frustrating, is that if it gives you the decision, and you've answered the questions correctly, as we said, but it gives you the decision outside of IR35, that gives you the starting position from HMRC to say, well, look, we acted in good faith, we've answered all these questions, that's the decision that we've got, and that's how we've applied it. And this soft landing that the Chancellor's talking about, I think, will come along in that sort of situation. Then HMRC should ultimately accept that and say, fine, everyone's acted in good faith, and we're not going to ultimately try and recover from the supply chain. The alternatives to CEST, well, they do a job and they provide a function. Some of them are actually quite good. And it's interesting. So I've had experience of one that I've looked at and where we've done a comparison between CEST and that. And, my gut feel would have been that tool would have been more inclined to take you outside of IR35. And actually, the reverse was true in that particular occasion. The sort of independent assessment tool was saying inside of IR35, whereas CEST was telling us outside of IR35. So it's quite a complex decision to make. And that's why there's an element of risk involved with it. I think those independent tools play a part, but you need to understand that it's not going to get you the get out of jail free cards should HMRC come knocking.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of looking at your liabilities and who's underwriting those CEST tools.
And that's the thing is, what we've seen is some end users, some engagers, not being comfortable with that, and saying that, look, we don't want, because in effect what's happening with those insurance policies, the insurance, it's the contractor who's taking out the insurance, and the engagers relying on the fact that if there's a problem, that the insurance will pay the contractor's underpayment so that it doesn't flow up the chain. And there are different ways of doing it, but that on most of the ones I've seen so far is how they've worked. And some engagers are saying we're not comfortable with that. So what some engagers are doing, looking at taking out their own professional indemnity insurance that ultimately will cover the decision making, depending on the numbers and other things. So there is an element of protection there, but I don't think it's perceived to be the sort of the get out of jail free card by some engagers, but that'll obviously differ from case to case. So they are a useful tool to have, but they don't necessarily do the same thing as CEST and don't give the same protection. Statements of works, I thought that was perhaps going to be bigger than it has been. And I think that's good because I think people are appreciating that that's not necessarily as easy as it might seem on the can. It's a different model. You're not a recruiter. You're not supplying people. You're supplying services, whether they be IT, whether they be care, whether they be whatever they might be providing, which requires a completely different approach to supplying individuals. I am aware of some that have taken quite a high level approach to just simply changing the definition of the services. I think you'd have to have a good, robust attitude to risk if you were prepared to engage on that basis, because I just think it's an unknown at this stage.
My observation on that, having just, set up and run statement of works businesses, is that a number of the recruiters who spoke to me about that as a possibility simply did not understand enough about what their workers were doing to package up a statement of works and to cost the risk.
Absolutely. And this is pre-IR35, but ultimately I had a client that did that from an IT perspective and didn't understand that actually we're providing IT services, not people. And it's to a bank, rather large bank, their IT infrastructure fell over, and the first she knew there was a problem was when she was asked to give evidence to a select committee about her IT company's involvement in that. So you don't really want to go down that path. But and then the other things really, none of them are the magic answer. So I was saying to you earlier that I had an engager ring me yesterday say, I've just had a recruiter on the phone that's got a tool that will guarantee that everyone's outside of IR35. And it's the
marvellous.
I know, absolutely. It's sort of like, crikey, Harry Potter is living. It's like, well, that that's not possible, but the psychology of selling, someone was selling a solution to his problem. And it's like, how can they guarantee that everyone's going to be outside of IR35? You can't physically do that. So clearly they're out there, and people will buy them because ultimately it's providing a solution. Whether that solution is going to be robust enough, we're going to have to wait and see, I think, ultimately.
Okay. Simon, thank you very much for your time. We're going to bring it to a close there. For any listeners who feel they would like some legal advice, to contact you via Brabners' website. Brabners'
website, and all the details are on there, so happy to help.
Okay, thank you. And for all our listeners, best wishes in getting through this implementation period. And if you'd like to engage with recruitment leadership in terms of developing business, your sales strategy, and indeed working towards business exit or other event, then please contact me, Alison Humphreys, via the Recruitment Leadership website. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, review and share so that others can find the podcast too. We really appreciate your support. If you have any questions about the topics covered or wish to find out more about recruitment leadership, please email alison@recruitmentleadership.co.uk referencing the podcast. We're also on LinkedIn, where you can follow Recruitment Leadership and connect with Alison Humphreys. Thank you for listening, and we hope you join us next time for another episode of the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.